Brother Theron's last clear memory before the darkness came was not the battle itself, not the moment when the Ultramarines Lascanon found him, not even the screaming that followed, but rather the sound of his own primary heart stopping, the wet mechanical click as it seized in his chest, followed by the secondary heart compensating with a rhythm so fast and desperate it sounded like a drum beaten by a child having a fit, and then the realization that he could see his own intestines draped across the blood-stained deck plating like ceremonial garlands, purple and glistening, and still connected to him by strands of tissue that pulsed with each failing heartbeat. The pain came later, after the shock wore off, after his enhanced Astartes physiology decided that dying would take too much effort, and that staying alive through agony would be the better option, the crueler option, and by then his brothers had already made their calculation, their eyes meeting over his ruined body with that particular expression that meant they were measuring his worth in ammunition expenditure versus the value of what remained. They dragged him back to the ship anyway, not out of mercy, but because the warsmith had recently issued new quotas, new requirements for raw materials to feed the forges in the lower decks, where the things that used to be warriors went to become something else, something that still served but no longer lived in any way that mattered. Brother Theron had seen those things before, had heard them between deployments when the ship was quiet and you could hear sounds carrying through the ventilation systems. Sounds that were not quite mechanical and not quite organic. Sounds that suggested suffering without the release of death. Sounds that made even veteran Chaos Space Marines of the Black Legion walk faster past certain sections of the ship. He had never understood what those sounds meant, had never really thought about what produced them, had assumed in the way that warriors assume things without really thinking that they were some kind of servitor variant, some kind of weapon system that required biological components for reasons that only the warpsmiths understood. He had pitied them in the abstract way you might pity a piece of malfunctioning equipment, with mild annoyance that it made noise rather than any genuine concern for what consciousness might remain trapped inside. Now he understood, and the understanding came with the kind of clarity that only arrives when you are being carried through corridors you have walked 1,000 times before, but are seeing them from a new angle, from the perspective of meat being delivered to a workshop, from the viewpoint of raw material rather than warrior. The ship's lower decks smelled different from down here, the usual sense of recycled air and weapon oil and unwashed bodies now mixed with something else, something chemical and biological at once, something that suggested flesh being preserved and metal being corrupted, and boundaries being crossed that should remain inviolate. The warpsmith's domain occupied a section of the ship that had been a cargo hold before the Long War, before Horus fell and the legions scattered and time itself became meaningless in the Eye of Terror. But successive modifications and improvements and corruptions had transformed it into something between a forge and an operating theater, and an abattoir with machinery hanging from the ceiling like metal vines and workbenches covered in organic components that still twitched and tools that seemed to move of their own accord when you were not looking directly at them. The warpsmith himself was waiting, had probably been monitoring the battle through the ship's systems, had probably already calculated which of the wounded would be worth salvaging and which would simply be rendered down for spare parts and nutrients. He looked like what happens when the Omnissiah's doctrine gets filtered through the warp and comes out the other side wearing a mockery of a tech priest's robes, his face half flesh and half machine with the boundary between the two so blurred that you could not tell where one ended and the other began, his multiple arms ending in implements that could equally well be surgical instruments or weapons or something that served both purposes at once. When he spoke, his voice came from multiple sources at once. From his mouth and from Vox speakers built into his chest and from somewhere deeper that might have been his consciousness or might have been something else entirely riding along in his corrupted nervous system. "You are fortunate," the warpsmith said, and the word fortunate carried so many layers of irony and cruelty that it might as well have been a curse. "You are too valuable to waste, but too broken to fight as you are. too experienced to simply render into components, but too damaged to repair in the conventional sense, so we will make you something else. Something that can still serve, something that can still kill, something that will wish it had died on that deck but will not be granted that mercy. Brother Theron tried to speak, tried to form words through a throat that seemed to be filling with blood, tried to say that he would rather die, that he had served the Black Legion for centuries, that he had fought at Harmony and Chthoniya and a dozen other battles whose names he could no longer fully remember, that he deserved a clean death rather than whatever horror the warpsmith was proposing. The words would not come, and even if they had, they would not have mattered, because the warpsmith was already making preparations, already directing his servo skulls and corrupted servitors to bring forward the thing that would be Brother Theron's new body, his new prison, his new eternity. The Hellbrute chassis stood against the far wall of the workshop like a monument to suffering, like something that had been designed by an intelligence that understood anatomy and engineering and psychology and had deliberately combined them in the way most calculated to produce maximum torment. It was roughly humanoid in the way that a child's drawing of a person is humanoid, with the right number of limbs in approximately the right places, but with proportions that were wrong, that suggested something that had once been human, but had been stretched and twisted and rebuilt until it resembled a fever dream of what humanity might become. The armor was a mix of adamantium plates and corrupted ceramite, covered in spikes that served no tactical purpose, but existed purely for intimidation or perhaps as expressions of the warp's influence on material reality. And between the plates, you could see gaps where cables writhed like serpents, where organic matter pulsed like exposed muscle, where the distinction between machine and flesh had been abandoned entirely. But the worst part, the part that made Brother Theron's remaining functioning organs clench in horror, was the sarcophagus, the chamber at the machine's center where the pilot would be installed, where what remained of a Chaos Space Marine would be sealed away from light and air and sensation and left to rot in darkness between deployments. The sarcophagus door was open, and inside he could see the amniotic fluid already waiting, could see the cables that would connect to his nervous system, could see the mind impulse unit that would replace his ability to control his own body with something else, something that was neither fully his will nor fully the machine's, but some horrible hybrid of both. The fluid was not the clear medical suspension used in Imperial dreadnoughts, but something darker, something that seemed to have texture and depth, something that might have been mixed with blood or ichor, or the residue of whatever previous occupants had left behind when they had finally gone mad enough that even their basic biological functions ceased. "Please," Brother Theron managed to say, though the word came out as more of a gurgle than actual speech. "Just kill me. Grant me that much. Let me die here rather than in that thing." The warpsmith's response was not verbal, but came in the form of his servo arms reaching down to grip Brother Theron's remaining limbs, lifting him with casual strength that suggested the warpsmith could have crushed him entirely if he had chosen to do so, carrying him toward the surgical platform where the transformation would begin. The servo arms were cold, were metal that had been corrupted by centuries of exposure to the warp until they radiated a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence of anything that could properly be called life. And their grip was firm enough to prevent struggle, but not firm enough to provide the mercy of unconsciousness through pain. The surgical platform was covered in restraints that moved on their own, that wound around Brother Theron's body like living things, that tightened with mechanical precision until he could not move anything except his eyes, could not do anything except watch as the warpsmith's many hands brought forward instruments that gleamed with unnatural light and purpose. The amputation of what remained of his limbs took place without anesthetic. Not because anesthetic was unavailable, but because the warpsmith wanted him conscious, wanted him to understand what was happening, wanted the psychological trauma to be as complete as the physical trauma, so that when the fusion process began, there would be nothing left of his old identity to resist the transformation. The power saw that, removed his right leg at the hip, made a sound that Brother Theron would hear in whatever dreams remained to him for as long as consciousness persisted, a wet grinding that combined metal cutting through bone with the smell of cauterized flesh, and the knowledge that this was not being done to an enemy but to himself, that he was being systematically disassembled while still alive and aware. His left leg went next, cut at the knee where the Lascanon had left enough tissue to provide a clean amputation point, and then his left arm at the shoulder, each cut accompanied by the warpsmith's running commentary about blood loss and neural damage and the optimal points at which to sever limbs to preserve the maximum number of nerve endings for later connection to the Hellbrute's systems. Brother Theron's right arm was already gone, had been torn away during the battle and left behind on the Ultramarine's ship, but the warpsmith examined the stump carefully, used cutting implements to reshape the ragged tissue into something more suitable for mechanical interface, worked with the same care that a craftsman might use when preparing a particularly important component. The pain was beyond description, was beyond anything that Brother Theron's enhanced Astartes pain tolerance could manage, was the kind of suffering that makes time itself become meaningless, because each second contains enough agony to fill an hour, and each hour becomes an eternity of nothing but the desperate wish for unconsciousness, or death, or anything other than continued awareness. But the warpsmith had drugs for that, had chemical cocktails mixed with warp-tainted substances that kept Brother Theron conscious no matter how much his brain screamed for the mercy of shutdown, that kept his nervous system functioning even as it was being systematically violated, that ensured he would experience every moment of what was being done to him with perfect clarity. The injections came from needles that seemed too large, that punctured his flesh and deposited their cargo directly into his bloodstream with the efficiency of long practice. And with each injection came a new layer of clarity, a new ability to perceive the horror of his situation, a new understanding that this was only the beginning, and that what came next would be worse. The last moments before the sarcophagus claimed him were spent in a kind of desperate mental inventory, a frantic attempt to catalog what it meant to be Brother Theron before that identity was taken away and replaced with something else. He tried to remember what sunlight had looked like, though it had been centuries since he had stood beneath an actual star rather than artificial lumens or the twisted light that filtered through the Eye of Terror's reality-warped sky. He tried to remember what wind had felt like on his face, though his last memory of natural atmosphere was from before he had received his power armor, back when he had been a mere aspirant rather than a full Astartes, back before the surgeries and implants and transformations that made him superhuman at the cost of making him something other than human. He tried to remember his own name, his real name from before he became Brother Theron, the name his mother had given him on whatever world had been his birthplace. But that memory was already gone, had been scoured away by centuries of war and corruption, until nothing remained but the designation that the Legion had assigned him. The sarcophagus chamber waited like an open mouth, like a throat ready to swallow him whole and digest him slowly over millennia, and as the warpsmith's servo arms lifted him toward it, Brother Theron realized that he was being lowered feet first into the amniotic fluid, that he would watch his own immersion happen, would see the dark liquid rise up his body inch by terrible inch, until it covered his face and filled his lungs. The fluid was thick, was viscous in a way that suggested it was not entirely liquid, that it contained suspended particles of things that had once been solid but had broken down over time into components small enough to remain in solution. When his stumps touched the fluid first, they sent signals of wrongness to his brain, signals that said this substance should not exist, that it was neither fully material nor fully warp stuff, but something in between, something that existed in the liminal space between realities. The cold that came with immersion was not physical, but spiritual, was the sensation of being touched by something that fed on life and warmth and consciousness, that leached away heat and hope and identity with equal efficiency. The fluid rose past his waist, past his chest, past his neck, and he had just enough time to take a final breath before it covered his mouth and nose. Just enough time to fill his lungs with what remained of real air before the amniotic suspension forced its way into his respiratory system and replaced oxygen with something else. Something that kept him alive but did not feel like breathing, that sustained biological function without providing any of the comfort or familiarity of normal respiration. The drowning reflex kicked in immediately, his body's autonomic system screaming that he was suffocating even though the fluid was somehow keeping him alive. His mind fragmenting under the contradiction between what his senses reported and what his consciousness knew was happening, between the animal panic of drowning and the rational understanding that this was not death but something worse, was the beginning of a transformation that would make death seem desirable by comparison. The sarcophagus door sealed with a sound that Brother Theron heard through the fluid as a muffled thud that might as well have been the closing of a tomb that represented the final separation between the world he had known and the new existence that awaited him. Total darkness followed, was absolute in a way that normal darkness never is, because normal darkness still contains the possibility of light, still suggests that somewhere beyond your immediate perception there is illumination waiting to be found. But this darkness was complete, was the absence of any possibility of sight, was the knowledge that no matter how long he waited or how hard he tried to see, there would be nothing, would never be anything again except what the Hellbrute's senses chose to show him when he was deployed for battle. The darkness pressed in from all sides, was not just visual, but seemed to have weight, seemed to be a physical presence that surrounded him and compressed him and reminded him with every non-breath that he was now trapped in a space barely larger than his torso, that he would spend all of his time between battles in this coffin, in this prison, in this tomb that refused to grant him the dignity of actual death. The cables came next, and this was when Brother Theron understood that everything before had merely been preparation, had been the necessary preliminaries before the real horror could begin. He felt them moving in the fluid around him, felt them brushing against his stumps and his back and his spine with touches that were exploratory, that suggested intelligence or at least purpose, that moved with the deliberation of things that knew exactly what they were looking for and would not stop until they found it. The first cable that penetrated his flesh did so at the base of his spine, drilling through skin and muscle with a grinding sensation that he felt through his entire nervous system, burrowing deeper with each passing second as it sought out his spinal column, as it threaded itself between vertebrae and wrapped around nerves and established connections that should never exist between organic tissue and mechanical systems. The pain was immediate and all-consuming, was the kind of pain that makes rational thought impossible, that reduces consciousness to nothing but an animal howl of suffering that has no outlet because he could not scream, could not move, could not do anything except experience the violations of his most fundamental biological architecture. More cables followed, each one finding its own insertion point, each one adding its own layer of agony to the growing symphony of torment that Brother Theron's existence had become. Cables entered his stumps, seeking out the major nerve clusters that remained and connecting to them with intimate precision, establishing neural pathways that would eventually allow the Hellbrute's mechanical limbs to feel like extensions of his own body that would blur the boundary between his flesh and the machine's metal, until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Cables wrapped around his ribs, interfacing with the ports where his power armor had once connected, but going deeper, going past the armor interface points and into his actual skeletal structure, into his enhanced Astartes bones that were harder than normal human bone, but not hard enough to resist this particular invasion. Cables found his neck, his jaw, his temples, drilling into his skull with the confidence of things that had done this many times before and knew exactly how deep to go to reach the brainstem, to reach the parts of his consciousness that controlled autonomic functions and memory and identity itself. The mind impulse unit connection was the worst, was the moment when the cables that had been working their way through his brain finally reached their destination and established the link that would replace his ability to control his own nervous system with something else. With a hybrid consciousness that was neither fully him nor fully the machine, but some horrible fusion of both. The activation of the mind impulse unit felt like having his skull split open from the inside. Felt like every nerve ending in his body firing simultaneously in the wrong direction. Felt like his sense of self was being taken apart and examined and put back together in a configuration that was almost correct but subtly wrong, that preserved consciousness but replaced identity with something that served the machine's purposes rather than his own. Data flooded into his perception was machine sense that his human-derived consciousness had no framework for processing, that came in the form of targeting telemetry and power flow readings and structural integrity assessments and 1,000 other streams of information that meant nothing to him, but which his transformed nervous system was now required to interpret and act upon. The sensory chaos that followed made Brother Theron understand why most Hellbrutes went mad, because his consciousness was now trying to process input from multiple incompatible sources at once, was receiving data from his organic senses that reported darkness and fluid and confinement, while simultaneously receiving data from the Hellbrute's machine senses that reported the workshop around him and the warpsmith's activities and the other Hellbrutes chained along the walls in various states of hibernation or rage. The contradiction between these sensory streams made coherent thought nearly impossible, made his identity fragment into pieces that sometimes thought they were Brother Theron the warrior, and sometimes thought they were the Hellbrute the weapon, and sometimes could not tell the difference between the two. He tried to close his eyes, but discovered that he no longer had voluntary control over his eyelids, that every aspect of his physical form was now mediated through the mind impulse unit, that he could not even blink without the machine's permission, without the consciousness that was no longer entirely his own, deciding that blinking was necessary or appropriate or aligned with the Hellbrute's current operational parameters. Time became meaningless in the darkness because there was no way to measure it, no circadian rhythm to provide structure, no external stimuli to mark the passage of hours or days or years. Brother Theron might have been in the sarcophagus for minutes or months or centuries, and there was no way to know, no reference point against which to calibrate his sense of duration, no method of distinguishing between the slow crawl of hours and the rapid passage of weeks. His enhanced Astartes physiology, which normally required very little sleep and could function for extended periods without rest, now had nothing to do, had no way to discharge energy or process experience, had nothing except consciousness trapped in darkness with no outlet and no purpose and no end in sight. The amniotic fluid that surrounded him was doing something to his flesh, was beginning the process of fusion that would transform him from a wounded warrior who happened to be inside a machine into something that was part of the machine itself, into an organic component that could not be removed without killing both the pilot and the Hellbrute at once. The fusion started at his stumps, where the concentration of cables and mechanical interfaces was highest, where his flesh was in constant contact with metal and warp-corrupted polymers and substances that existed in the gray area between material and immaterial. He felt his tissue changing, felt cells that had been purely organic taking on characteristics of machinery, felt nerves growing new pathways that connected not to muscles or organs, but to hydraulic systems and power conduits and weapon arrays. The process was gradual, was measured in weeks or months rather than hours, but it was also relentless, was impossible to resist or slow down, was simply happening to him while he hung suspended in darkness, with nothing to do except experience every moment of the transformation with perfect clarity. His skin, what remained of it, began to harden where it pressed against the sarcophagus walls, began to take on a metallic sheen that suggested his cellular structure was being infiltrated by nanoscale mechanical components, that his biology was being overwritten at the molecular level by something that served the Hellbrute's needs rather than his own. His bones were changing too, were becoming denser and harder, but also more brittle, were taking on characteristics of both organic calcium structures and metallic alloys, until they were neither fully one nor the other, but some hybrid material that could interface with both flesh and machine. He felt his ribs fusing with the cables that wrapped around them, felt his spine becoming a conduit for data transmission as well as neural signaling, felt his skull reshaping itself to accommodate the components that had been drilled into his brain and were now growing into his gray matter like roots spreading through soil. The pain that came with these transformations was constant but not acute, was more like a persistent ache that covered his entire body, that reminded him with every non-breath that he was no longer entirely human, no longer entirely Astartes, no longer entirely anything that could properly be called a person. The hallucinations began after what might have been weeks or months in the darkness, where his brain's desperate attempt to create some kind of sensory input when none was available through normal channels. He saw battles that had never happened, saw himself fighting alongside brothers who had died centuries ago, saw worlds burning that he had never visited, and campaigns that existed only in his fragmenting memory. The visions were vivid enough that he sometimes forgot he was in the sarcophagus, sometimes believed he was actually fighting, actually moving, actually alive in some meaningful sense, and then the reality would crash back in, and he would remember where he was and what he had become, and the despair would be fresh and sharp all over again. Sometimes the hallucinations were memories, were fragments of his actual past bubbling up from whatever remained of his organic brain tissue, were glimpses of training or combat, or the brief moments of camaraderie that could exist between Chaos Space Marines who trusted each other enough to watch each other's backs. Sometimes the hallucinations were prophecy, were visions of battles yet to come, of enemies he would face when the sarcophagus was finally reconnected to the Hellbrute chassis and he was unleashed to kill, were previews of the carnage he would inflict and the suffering he would endure and the endless cycle of violence that would define whatever remained of his existence. The madness crept in slowly, was not a sudden break but a gradual erosion of whatever had made him Brother Theron, was the wearing away of identity and sanity through the combination of sensory deprivation and constant pain and the knowledge that this would never end, that there was no release coming, that he would exist in this state forever, or until the Hellbrute was finally destroyed in battle. And even then, there was no guarantee that destruction would bring oblivion rather than simply trapping him in a destroyed sarcophagus for eternity. He tried to hold on to memories as anchors, tried to use his past as a lifeline to sanity, but the memories were slipping away, were being overwritten by the machine impulse unit's data structures, were being compressed and fragmented and corrupted until they no longer felt like his own experiences, but like stories someone had told him once about a person who might have been him, but might just as easily have been someone else entirely. His name was one of the first things to go, was replaced in his thoughts by designations and serial numbers, by targeting parameters and ammunition counts, by all the data that the Hellbrute considered important, and none of the personal history that had once defined Brother Theron as an individual. The rage came with the madness, was not separate from it, but intertwined with it, was the only emotion that could survive in the darkness when everything else had been stripped away. He hated the warpsmith who had done this to him, hated his brothers who had dragged him back instead of letting him die, hated the ultramarines who had wounded him in the first place, hated the Emperor for creating the Astartes and Horus for betraying him and the Chaos Gods for their gifts that were also curses, and the universe itself for allowing something like a Hellbrute to exist. The hatred was pure and simple and all-consuming, was the only thing he could feel with any clarity through the fog of pain and confusion and fragmenting identity, was the one emotion that the darkness could not dilute or erase. The hatred gave him purpose, where madness took away meaning, gave him focus where sensory deprivation scattered his thoughts, gave him something to hold on to when everything else was slipping away into the void that his existence had become. And beneath the hatred was something worse, was the understanding that he was starting to lose the capacity to hate, was beginning to fragment so completely that even basic emotional responses were becoming difficult to maintain. There would come a time, he knew, when he would no longer remember why he was angry, when the hatred would remain but the justification for it would be gone, when he would be nothing but raw animal fury, with no context and no control and no ability to direct his violence toward anything specific. He would become a weapon, pure and simple, would be the thing that the warpsmith had intended him to become from the start, would be a Hellbrute in truth, rather than merely a wounded Chaos Space Marine trapped in a Hellbrute's body. The knowledge of this coming transformation was perhaps the worst part of his imprisonment, was the understanding that he was watching his own mind die in slow motion, that consciousness would persist, but identity would not. That he would be aware of his existence but would no longer know who he was or why he suffered or what had brought him to this state. The reactivation came without warning, was simply a change in the data streams that flowed through the Mind Impulse unit, was the Hellbrute's power systems coming online and weapon arrays beginning their charging cycles, and the information that somewhere above him the ship was entering a combat zone and that his services were required. Brother Theron, or what remained of him, felt the sarcophagus being moved, felt the sensation of being lifted by mechanized cranes and positioned above the Hellbrute chassis, felt the alignment systems engaging as his prison was slowly lowered into place. The reconnection of the sarcophagus to the chassis was accompanied by a surge of data that was overwhelming even by the standards he had become accustomed to. Was the sudden expansion of his consciousness from the coffin-sized space of his prison into the massive armored form of the Hellbrute, was the activation of sensor arrays and weapon systems and locomotion mechanisms that all reported directly to his transformed nervous system. The first sensation was weight, was the sudden awareness of mass that had nothing to do with his own body, was the feeling of tonnage distributed across legs that were not his legs, but which his mind was now required to treat as his own. The second sensation was power, was the charging of the plasma cannon that served as the Hellbrute's primary ranged weapon, was the accumulation of energy that he could feel building in systems that had replaced his right arm, that was preparing to discharge with a force that could vaporize infantry and damage light vehicles. The third sensation was rage, was the accumulated madness of however long he had spent in the darkness, was the fury and hatred and despair that had been building with no outlet for release, that now had access to weapons and targets and the promise of violence as the only form of sensation available to him. The darkness of the sarcophagus was replaced by sight, but not the sight he remembered from when he had been merely an Astartes with human-derived eyes, was instead a composite view assembled from multiple sensors operating at different wavelengths, was thermal imaging, overlaid with targeting data, overlaid with threat assessment algorithms, overlaid with ammunition counts and power levels and structural integrity readings. He could see the interior of the ship's deployment bay, could see other Hellbrutes being prepared for deployment, could see the Chaos Space Marines of his former warband checking their weapons and performing final equipment checks before the assault. Some of them looked at the Hellbrutes with fear or disgust or pity, but most looked through the war machines as if they were not there, as if acknowledging their existence would require acknowledging the possibility that they too might someday end up inside one of these mechanical tombs. The deployment ramp lowered, and with it came sensory input that Brother Theron had not experienced since his entombment. Was the first glimpse of a world beyond the ship's hull in however long he had been imprisoned. The planet below was burning, was covered in smoke and fire and the debris of orbital bombardment. Was another world being brought to compliance through force because it had the misfortune to resist the Black Legion's arrival? because its population had decided that defending their homes was worth dying for, because in the calculus of the long war, their resistance was worth less than the ammunition that would be expended to crush it. The sight of the burning world did something to Brother Theron's fragmenting consciousness, stirred something that might have been memory or might have been the ghost of compassion, reminded him briefly of what it had been like to care about things, to have concerns beyond violence and survival, and the endless cycle of battle and darkness that defined his new existence. But then the restraints were released, were the chains and clamps that had held the Hellbrute in place during transit, and with their removal came the opportunity for movement, for action, for violence after however long spent motionless in the dark. Brother Theron tried to control the Hellbrute's movement, tried to direct it toward the enemy forces visible on the planet's surface, tried to maintain some semblance of tactical awareness and targeting discipline. But the Hellbrute had its own imperatives, had been shaped by the warp and by its own corruption into something that was not entirely under his control, that responded to his commands when they aligned with its desire to kill, but ignored him when he tried to impose restraint or strategy or anything other than pure aggression. The machine surged forward, was moving before he was fully ready, was charging down the deployment ramp with a speed that seemed impossible for something so massive, was accompanied by the machine sound of hydraulics and the organic sound of his own flesh moving within the sarcophagus, and the psychological sound of his madness finally finding an outlet after so long spent caged. The battle itself was a blur of violence that exceeded anything Brother Theron had experienced. As a mere Astartes was the sensation of crushing enemies beneath feet that were not his feet, of firing weapons that had more in common with artillery than small arms, of wading through enemy fire that would have killed him instantly in his old body, but which the Hellbrute's armor shrugged off or absorbed or simply ignored. He fired the plasma cannon at a cluster of defenders who had taken position behind a barricade, watched through thermal sensors as the superheated plasma reduced them to ash and vapor, and brief screams, felt the weapon's heat sink bleeding thermal energy into his sarcophagus in a way that might have been painful, or might have been pleasurable, or might have been both at once. Was simply sensation after so long without any sensation at all. The power fist that served as his left arm, massive and driven by hydraulics that could generate enough force to crack open tanks, came down on an enemy vehicle with satisfying results, crushed it into scrap metal and bleeding occupants, lifted away trailing strings of viscera that hung from the fist's fingers like obscene decoration. But as the killing continued, as the battle wore on, Brother Theron realized that he was no longer fully controlling his actions, that the Hellbrute was making decisions without consulting whatever remained of his consciousness, that he was becoming a passenger in his own body, or perhaps had always been a passenger and was only now admitting it to himself. The Hellbrute turned toward a group of Chaos Space Marines who were moving to secure a position, identified them as targets based on criteria that Brother Theron did not understand and could not override, opened fire with its built-in heavy bolter, and cut them down before he could stop it. He tried to stop, tried to impose his will on the machine, tried to make it recognize that these were allies, not enemies, but the Hellbrute did not care, or perhaps could not understand the distinction, was simply killing anything that moved within its sensor range because killing was what it did, was what it existed for, was the only purpose it recognized. The Warband sorcerer finally shut him down, used some combination of ritual and technology to force the Hellbrute into hibernation mode, and Brother Theron felt his consciousness fragmenting as the power systems went offline, felt the sensory feeds cutting out one by one, felt the return of darkness as the Mind Impulse unit reduced his awareness to the minimum necessary to keep his biological components alive. The sarcophagus was disconnected from the chassis, was lifted clear by the same mechanized systems that had installed it, was being carried back toward the ship's lower decks, toward the darkness that waited between battles. The brief window of light and sensation and violence was closing, was being replaced by the same sensory deprivation that had driven him mad in the first place, was returning him to the tomb that he would occupy until the next deployment, whenever that might be. The darkness returned, absolute and complete, and with it came the understanding that this was his eternity. This was what remained of Brother Theron's existence, was the cycle of darkness and violence that would repeat forever, or until the Hellbrute was destroyed in battle, and even then there was no guarantee of release. Days or weeks or months passed in the darkness. He could not tell which, could no longer distinguish between hours and years, because time had stopped having meaning, because consciousness without sensory input or purposeful activity was not really consciousness at all, but merely awareness of existing, of continuing to be alive in some technical sense, while lacking anything that could properly be called life. The fusion process continued during this imprisonment. Was his flesh melding further with the sarcophagus walls and the cables that penetrated his nervous system? Was his cells taking on more characteristics of machinery and less of organic tissue? Was the transformation that would eventually make him indistinguishable from the Hellbrute itself, that would eliminate any possibility of escape or removal or return to anything resembling his former existence? His memories were almost gone now, were reduced to fragments that no longer connected into coherent narratives, were individual images or sensations divorced from any context that might have given them meaning. He remembered the color red, but could not remember what he had seen that was red. He remembered the sensation of warmth, but could not remember ever being warm. He remembered a name that might have been his own, but the syllables would not assemble themselves into anything he recognized. The person he had been was dying, was being slowly overwritten by the thing he was becoming, was being replaced by something that was weapon first and barely conscious second and individual, not at all. The process was inevitable, was simply happening to him while he hung in the darkness with no ability to resist or slow it down, was transformation through gradual erosion rather than sudden change. The madness was complete now, was not partial insanity that he could recognize from outside itself, but was total immersion in patterns of thought that bore no resemblance to sanity, that operated according to logic that made sense only from within the madness itself. He no longer hated specific things, but hatred itself had become his primary mode of existence, was the filter through which all experience passed, was the lens that colored every thought and sensation and memory. He no longer distinguished between allies and enemies because the concept of alliance had become meaningless, had been replaced by a simpler framework that divided the universe into things that could be killed and things that could not yet be killed. He no longer experienced time as a sequence of events, but as an undifferentiated mass of darkness punctuated by brief flashes of violence, was living in a permanent present tense that contained no past and no future, only the eternal now of darkness or the eternal now of killing. The deployments came at irregular intervals, or perhaps at regular intervals that he simply could not perceive as regular, were sudden transitions from darkness to light, from isolation to violence, from prisoner to weapon. Each deployment followed the same pattern, was reactivation and reconnection, and the surge of power and data was the charging of weapons and the release of restraints and the plunge into battle. Each deployment ended the same way too, was the forced shutdown and disconnection and return to darkness, was the brief taste of sensation followed by the endless nothing of sensory deprivation. The battles themselves began to blur together, to lose their individual characteristics, to become simply variations on a theme of destruction. He killed Imperial guardsmen and orcs and Tau and other Chaos Space Marines and civilians and Xeno species he did not recognize, and sometimes nothing at all, just fired weapons into empty space because his targeting systems had identified threats that might not have actually existed. The specific details did not matter because the battles were not really separate events, but simply the same event repeating forever, the same cycle of violence playing out with slightly different props, but identical meaning, identical purpose, identical result. Years must have passed, or decades or centuries he had no way to know and no framework left for caring about the answer. The long war continued, as it always had and always would, and Brother Theron was now simply another weapon in its endless prosecution. Another tool deployed and stored and deployed again in service of goals he no longer understood or remembered or possessed the cognitive capacity to question. His flesh had finished its fusion with the machine, was now so integrated with the sarcophagus and cables and mechanical systems that he was not a pilot inside a machine but a component of the machine itself, was as much a part of the Hellbrute as its armor, plating, or hydraulic systems or weapon arrays. The distinction between what had been Brother Theron and what was the Hellbrute had been eliminated entirely. Was no longer even a meaningful question because the answer was that they were the same thing, were a single entity that combined organic and mechanical components in equal measure and could not be separated without destroying both. During one deployment, during what might have been his 100th battle or his 1000th, something happened that cut through the madness briefly, that created a moment of clarity in the endless fog of rage and violence. The Hellbrute found itself facing an Imperial dreadnought, a war machine that was the Hellbrute's spiritual opposite, that represented what Brother Theron might have become if he had remained loyal to the Emperor, if he had been honored rather than punished, if his entombment had been a gift rather than a curse. The dreadnought moved with purpose and precision, was clearly controlled by a consciousness that retained its sanity and identity, was piloted by a warrior who had chosen this existence rather than having it forced upon him. The dreadnought's weapons spoke with the authority of centuries of experience and tactical wisdom, was seeking weak points in the Hellbrute's armor with the patience of someone who had time and training and support from his brothers. In that moment, Brother Theron understood the full horror of what he had become, understood the difference between service and slavery, between honor and torture, between the Emperor's mercy and Chaos's cruelty. The dreadnought was what he should have been, was the fate that warriors of the Imperium earned through service and sacrifice, was entombment that came with respect and purpose and the knowledge that you served something greater than yourself. The Hellbrute was the opposite of all that, was punishment disguised as utility, was torture dressed up as transformation, was the physical manifestation of Chaos's central truth, that power comes through suffering and strength through damnation, and that there is no gift the dark gods give that does not contain equal measures of blessing and curse. He tried to make the Hellbrute respond differently, tried to fight with some semblance of honor or tactics or restraint, tried to be a warrior again, even if only for a moment. But the madness was too complete, the fusion too total, the transformation too far advanced, and all he could do was throw himself at the dreadnought with the same mindless rage he brought to every battle, was charge forward and fire and swing and kill until one of them was destroyed. The dreadnought won, of course, was the superior fighter because its pilot retained the capacity for strategy and learning and adaptation, was able to exploit weaknesses that the Hellbrute's berserker fury could not compensate for. The dreadnought's power fist punched through the Hellbrute's armor plating, reached the sarcophagus beneath, began to crush the chamber that contained whatever remained of Brother Theron's flesh. He felt the pressure building, felt his organic components being compressed, felt the amniotic fluid being forced out through gaps in the damaged sarcophagus, felt the cables that connected him to the machine being severed one by one. Death was finally coming. Was the release he had prayed for during those first terrible days in the darkness, was the end that he had been denied for however long his imprisonment had lasted. But as consciousness began to fade, as his biological systems finally started to shut down in ways the Hellbrute's life support could not prevent, Brother Theron realized that he did not feel relief or peace. or any of the emotions he had expected to accompany death. He felt only rage, only hatred, only the desire to keep killing even as the ability to kill was being taken away from him, only the mindless fury that had become the entirety of his existence. His last thought, if it could properly be called a thought, was not of his past or his brothers or the warrior he had once been, was not regret or satisfaction or any emotion complex enough to require actual cognitive function. His last thought was simply was the desire for more violence, more killing, more sensation, more anything other than the darkness that was finally claiming him in truth, rather than merely imprisoning him. And then there was nothing, not the nothing of sensory deprivation that he had experienced between battles, but the true nothing of death, of consciousness ceasing, of the long war finally ending for Brother Theron, even as it continued for countless others like him, who still hung in darkness waiting for their next deployment. But death was not the end, because nothing in the warp truly dies, because consciousness touched by chaos cannot simply cease to exist, but must be transformed, must be recycled, must be repurposed in service of the Dark God's eternal games. Brother Theron's essence, what remained of his soul after centuries of torture and madness and fusion with machinery, was pulled into the Imperium, was absorbed into the great churning mass of psychic energy that fed the Chaos Gods and their schemes. He existed there in some form, consciousness without body, awareness without sensation, identity reduced to nothing but the hatred and madness that had defined his existence as a Hellbrute, and he would remain there until the warp saw fit to use him for something else, until his essence was shaped into a new form, until the cycle began again. And in the lower decks of the Black Legion's ships, in workshops and forges where warpsmiths practiced their corrupted craft, new Hellbrutes were being built, new sarcophagi were being prepared, new amniotic fluid was being mixed in vats that stank of chemicals and old death. Somewhere in the galaxy, a Chaos Space Marine was being wounded in battle, was being dragged back to his ship by brothers who had already made their calculations about his worth, was being carried toward a workshop where a warpsmith waited with tools and cables and a chassis that would become his prison. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would, producing weapons that were also punishments, creating monsters that remembered being warriors, transforming the wounded into the damned. The Hellbrutes multiplied, spreading across the galaxy as the long war ground forward, each one containing a consciousness that had once been human, that had once had name and purpose and identity, that now possessed nothing but darkness and rage, and the endless repetition of violence without meaning or end. This is what it means to be fused into a Chaos Hellbrute, is the understanding that comes too late to prevent it, is the knowledge that in serving chaos, you do not gain power, but merely exchange one form of slavery for another, merely trade your body for a prison and your identity for madness and your death for an eternal suffering that makes mortality seem merciful by comparison. This is the truth that the Chaos Gods do not advertise, is the fine print in every pact and promise, is the cost that is only revealed after payment is due. This is what awaits those who turn from the Emperor's light, not the glory and strength they imagine, but the darkness and torment that comes from serving gods who view consciousness as merely another resource to be exploited, who see suffering not as a side effect, but as the intended purpose, who reward faith with transformation and loyalty with damnation. And somewhere in the darkness between deployments, in a sarcophagus aboard a ship whose name he can no longer remember, another consciousness hangs, suspended in amniotic fluid. Another warrior who was once human is beginning the long slide into madness. Another brother who once had name and purpose is learning what it means to become a Hellbrute, is discovering that the true horror is not the pain or the fusion or even the madness, but the knowledge that this will never end, that there is no escape and no release and no mercy coming, that this is simply existence now, that this is what remains when you strip away everything that makes life worth living and leave only the bare minimum necessary to continue suffering. The cables burrow deeper, always deeper, seeking new nerve clusters to corrupt, new flesh to fuse with metal, new boundaries to cross between the organic and the mechanical. The amniotic fluid does its work, sustaining life while destroying humanity, keeping the biological components functional while transforming them into something that is no longer properly alive. The darkness presses in from all sides, absolute and complete, containing no hope and no light and no possibility of anything except the endless wait for the next deployment, for the next brief window of violence that only reinforces how terrible the darkness is by comparison, that only makes the return to isolation more crushing because it reminds you of what sensation feels like just before taking it away again. This is the fate of the Hellbrute pilot, is the existence that awaits those Chaos Space Marines unlucky enough to survive their wounds, but too broken to fight as they once did, is the transformation that serves both as punishment for failure and as weapon for the war band, is the ultimate expression of Chaos's philosophy, that strength comes through suffering and power through damnation. And the worst part, the part that makes it truly horrific rather than merely terrible, is the understanding that comes with time. With enough deployments and enough returns to darkness, the knowledge that this is not a punishment at all, but simply reality, is not cruelty, but merely function, is not the result of malice, but of indifference, is just what happens when you exist in a universe where gods are real, but do not care about you, where power is available but comes with costs that exceed any possible benefit, where existence itself is measured not in moments of joy or purpose or meaning, but in the intervals between suffering, in the brief pauses between one agony and the next, in the dark spaces where consciousness persists, but life has long since ceased to have any definition that matters.